You should have in your possession lesson number 6, which is the final lesson of this series of classes. If by chance you don't have that, there are some copies out on the table in the foyer, and you feel free to help yourself to those. This test is really sort of an application of what we've studied and what we've learned so that we can put it into practice and be able to teach it to others. And that's the reason we do it. I think it's a pretty good exercise. I think it's worthwhile. And we've got about halfway down the page. If you were looking at the top, you got general questions. We covered those. And then some application questions. We were going over those when we left off last week. And we got down to talking about the multiple cups. And these are things, the question 3, does the Bible specifically mention the following things? And it does not. It doesn't mention any of those things, and yet we do them. And that's where sometimes people try to trip us up. Well, you don't have an instrument because you say the Bible doesn't mention it, but you have pews and the Bible doesn't mention those, see? And so you need to know how to answer that. There is an answer. There is a correct answer. But you need to be aware of that because you will fall into that trap sooner or later when you're talking to somebody, especially somebody who's kind of up on their arguments here. Well, we got down to talking about the multiple cups, but there's another one on the list here. Does the Bible say anything about a preacher's house?
Doesn't say anything about the house.
Right.
Provide the preacher with means to conduct his life if he's preaching the word.
Right. Yeah, the answer to the question is no, it does not. But, that was the passage I used. Did anybody have any other passages that they pulled out of to talk about supporting the preacher or a preacher having a home? Nobody had any other ones? Well, we'll look at 1 Corinthians 9:14. And, of course, this is the end of a long discussion that began back up in verse 1. He's arguing for his right to be supported. And in verse 14, he summarizes when he says, even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. That means get their living or derive their living from the gospel. There's a lot of things involved in a living. There could be a salary, there could be food, there could be housing, there could be, you think about, just for an example, in fact he uses, I think, that similar example up here in the text. But you think about in the military, we send our soldiers overseas. We support them. They get a paycheck, they get housing, they get uniforms, they get guns, they get ammunition. They're supplied with all the things that they need, you see. And that's the principle that's being outlined in these verses. He even says, let's see if I can get back, see if I can find that verse. Well, let's just go back. We'll just start with verse 4. And we'll just go through and outline the principles here. He says, do we have no right to eat and drink? Of course, everybody has a right to eat and drink in the ultimate sense, but what is he talking about here in this context?
Got to be provided for.
Yeah, have a right to eat and drink at church expense is what he's saying. Where the church, that's part of the support. Years ago, sometimes they would pay preachers with a chicken or with a sack of potatoes. And so the right to eat and drink. They have a right to have enough support for their family, verse 5, to take along a believing wife, as also the other apostles and brothers of the Lord. In verse 6, the right to refrain from working, meaning secular work. They have, in other words, to be supported to the extent that they don't have to work a secular job. Nothing wrong with that. I've done that in the past. But he's saying you have the right to be supported to the extent that you don't work a secular job. Then verse 7, that's the verse I was looking for. Whoever goes to war at his own expense. When we send our soldiers overseas, we cover their expenses. Food, clothing, shelter, ammunition, all of that you see. And so you have the right to have your expenses covered. Who plants a vineyard does not eat of its fruit. Who tends a flock does not drink of the milk of the flock. And then dropping down to verse 11, if we've sown spiritual things to you, what would be the spiritual things that the preacher sows?
Teaching the word.
The word. And so if we've sown spiritual things to you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? And of course the answer to that, no, it's not a great thing. Okay, it's not a great thing. It shouldn't be a big deal at all. And so you have all of those principles that are outlined in there, outlining that. And so that would authorize a church, if they so chose, to provide a house. And some churches used to do that. I think more and more churches have gotten away from that because it started out with good intentions, but it ended up being a drain on the church and on the preacher. Because the church has to pay to keep that house up. It's, belongs to them. And then the preacher, the value of that house becomes income. And he pays taxes on something that doesn't belong to him. And so it's not a good deal for preacher or church. So churches that used to do that have backed away from it. But it is authorized, and some churches still do that. And I just wanted you to see that it was authorized and how so.
Well, I would say in some other countries, under different tax
Yeah.
systems, it may be beneficial to still do it, but yeah, under our tax laws and things, it's better for a preacher to own his own house and sell it than a lot of the time than it is.
Yeah, in fact, when I was over in Burkesville, in that area, they had a house for the preacher, and I lived in it for a long time, and I got to be, I don't know, about 40 years old, and suddenly it hit me, if I die, Anna's out in the street, got no place to live. That was kind of eye-opening for me, and I thought, well, I better buy me a house, and so I did. But these are things that you need to think about, because someday you're not going to be preaching. Someday you may not be able to preach, and your wife's got to have a home. And if she's living in a preacher's house, and the preacher's, if he got to quit, she's out of a home. That's not good. So there's all kinds of things to consider. But the point is that it is authorized. It isn't unbiblical. It is a proper way to do it if you so choose, if it's agreeable to everybody. And then the next question, of course, we've already done that. Cite Bible authorization, we've already done that as we went through it. But the point being, even though those things aren't mentioned, none of those things are mentioned in the Bible, they're all authorized. And we'll come back and deal more with that principle just a little bit later. Now, I wanted to get a little specific. A lot of times when people used to discuss the authority question, sometimes the whole subject of institutionalism would come up. And so I thought I'd throw in a question on that. Does the Bible say, thou shalt not use the church treasury to direct benevolent aid to sinners? Does it say that anywhere?
What we are supposed to do.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't say that. So, you couldn't find that statement in the Bible, just like you couldn't find the statement, thou shalt not gamble, or thou shalt not abort a baby. You can't find those statements in the Bible, but you can find the principles that back those things up. And one of the issues between us, more conservative, and our more liberal-minded brethren is this issue of directing benevolent aid to sinners. And the Bible is very clear about this. Now, I'm going to ask you, what scriptures did you have on this?
1 Timothy 5:16.
Okay.
Tells us what we need to do for widows. If we have widows, we're supposed to support them ourselves unless they're widows indeed, which really puts the responsibility away from the church and on them too.
Yes, very good, very good. 1 Timothy 5, in fact, if you flip over there, verses 3 through 16, there's a whole section here on support of what he calls widows indeed. If you're reading in the Old King James Version, some other versions, like my New King James, will say really widows. It means indeed and really means the same thing, so it's the same idea. But he goes through here and he says that these widows indeed, or these real widows, have to meet certain criteria. And one of the things is found in verse 5. She who is really a widow, okay, and left alone, trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayer day and night. What does that tell you about her? She's a faithful Christian. That's right. She's a Christian and she's faithful at it. And notice there's something else there. She's left alone. She has no family to turn to. Okay, she's got nobody to turn to. And they didn't have welfare back then. And so who's she going to turn to? This is where the church steps in, you see. And then you come down here, verse 9, some more criteria. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number. This is the number to be supported. Not unless she's been the wife of one man. Well reported for good works, if she's brought up children, if she's lodged strangers, if she's washed the saints' feet, if she's relieved the afflicted, if she's diligently followed every good work. Now, I'd like to suggest you look at the way that verse starts. Well reported for good works, and look at how it ends. Diligently followed every good work. It starts and ends the same. And so that stuff in the middle are just examples, okay? She's involved in good works. For example, if she's brought up children, that's a good work. If she's lodged strangers, that's a good work. If she's washed the saints' feet, that's a good work. That's an extension of hospitality is what that amounts to. If she's relieved the afflicted, that's a good work. So sandwiched in between there are examples of good works. So it starts with good works, it ends with good works. In the middle there are examples. And then verse 11, refuse the younger widows. What does refuse mean? Yeah, say no to them. So, some people say, that's so heartless. That's so cruel. Well, this is God's word. God said this. There are certain people you refuse. There are certain people you say no to. There are certain people you're not supposed to help. And then he summarizes with the verse Steve quoted earlier, if any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them. Family takes care of family. That's first priority. And don't let the church be burdened. Specifically said there, don't put that on the church. So that the church, may relieve those who are really widows, which he's defined in the context there. Yes, Beverly.
They're talking about just money that they might need.
Not necessarily just money. Huh? I didn't.
Family, you think that is talking about just money?
It wouldn't necessarily have to be just money. It could be food, shelter, it could be all kinds of things.
And I'm not talking about any of that. I'm not talking about any financial thing.
Okay, go
How
ahead.
about just helping, Jen?
Oh yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, if she needs something done, needs something done around the house or whatever. Yeah, I think that'd be in keeping with these verses for sure. I think that's a good point, by the way.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Is the reason why younger ones should be refused or not to be taken care of? Because it was pretty much customary that if they were young and lost their husband, that they remarried right away?
I think that's a part of it for sure. In fact, if you're going down here to verse 14, therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house. That's how she would be supported then. She would get a husband and all of that. So yeah, I think that's a part of it here. There's also a little bit more going on here than meets the eye, which we don't have time to get into tonight. This wasn't just about support. These women were supported in exchange for services that they rendered to the church. So it wasn't like you're just handing money out. They were servants. And that's why he talks about these good works. She can do, these are some things she can do in exchange for her services. So that's another aspect, and I'm sure when we get there in our Bible studies on Sunday morning, we'll talk about that. But there's a lot more here going on than meets the eye at first. But certainly we can see that distinction between individual and local church obligations. And she was a widow indeed. Anybody have any other passages?
16:1,
Yeah.
when he talks, where we have the example of taking up the collection, he uses the term, well, the way mine words it, now concerning the collection for the saints.
Yeah, for the
So he specifically refers to that collection for the saints.
Yeah.
It specifies what that is for.
Yeah.
And there's where we need to make it understood with people. There's nothing wrong individually helping whoever. We got an opportunity. But when we help out of the church treasury, we need to know who it is and do it in the right way.
Yeah, make sure that they are Christians.
It's a whole different matter. It's my individual money than the money that's been taken up in the collection. That's a whole nother matter.
Yeah, exactly right. In fact, that's really what 1 Timothy 5:16 is saying. There's a difference between the individual and the church, and the work of the individual and the work of the church. Yes, sir.
You cannot read the divided kingdom, books like Jeremiah, and walk away thinking that God is okay when we kind of do things our way and not his way.
Yeah.
All throughout the divided kingdom, kings are condemned for doing things that they thought were a good idea, but were not in accordance to what he told them to do.
Very good.
And
Yeah.
he's the same God today. We cannot think that because God has said that we can do these things, that he will be happy if we take liberties to do things our way.
Exactly right. Yeah, we have to restrict ourselves to what he has said in his word and leave it at that. Now, just to keep you, if you're talking with your institutional brother about this, just to keep you from getting yourself out on a limb, understand this, and I've mentioned this before. Suppose the church is going to help a member of the congregation and she's married to an unbeliever. You reckon she's going to help him with that money? Well, of course she is. And if you're having that conversation with your liberal, I said, well, you're giving it to the center. No, you're not. You're giving it to her. And then she's doing her obligation to support her family. What if she's got kids that haven't been baptized? You reckon she's going to feed them? Well, sure she is. Sure she is. So there might be little quibbly things that you'll get back from. I say this because you need to be aware when you're talking to your liberal brethren, that's the kind of quibbly things they'll throw at you. And it's a quibble. But of course they're going to help their unbelieving spouse and their children who haven't been baptized. Wouldn't you? Of course you would. Of course you would.
They usually use Galatians 6:10 though,
Yeah.
and stop about halfway in the middle of it.
Yeah. Do good to all men. Yeah. And of course that's not even talking about congregational activity anyway.
Talking about financial, really.
Right.
I mean, that's talking about spiritually helping them.
Yeah.
Really, when you look at the context,
Yeah.
we just went
We
through it
just
the
went
other
through that
day.
the other day. He's not really talking about doing good deeds per se. He's talking about helping one another to heaven is the whole context there, verses 1 through 10. That's right. But anybody have any other verses before I put mine up there? Okay, 2 Corinthians 9. In fact, you could say 8 and 9, both chapters. And he says over and over again that the relief was to the saints. Now let me go ahead and put up what I had here. In the Bible, and this is the same argument you would use if you were going to talk about instrumental music. In the Bible, there are 9 passages that talk about music and worship. Every single one of them say, sing, 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 all the way through. There are also 9 passages, if I counted correctly, that have to do with church benevolence. Does the Bible say thou shalt not use the church treasury to direct benevolent aid to sinners? No, it doesn't say that. Well, then why should we or should we not use the church treasury? And here's why. There is no authority, okay? And that's what these classes are all about, authority, authorization, permission. There is no permission, there is no authority, generic or specific, for that. All the relevant passages, and there they are, Acts 2, 4, 6, 11, Romans 15, 1 Corinthians 16, 2 Corinthians 8, 9, 1 Timothy. That's all the passages have to do with the church treasury and helping the needy. There are no other passages. And they all say saints or brethren or something to that effect. Okay. And so that's why we confine ourselves to that. And some people say, well, that sounds so harsh and so cruel. But these others can be helped. And we just talked about it. How are we going to help these others who are outside the body? Out of our own pockets, that's right. Not out of the Lord's treasury, but out of our own pockets. So the Lord, it's not like the Lord has just ignored them, but he's saying the church has a limited function, and part of that is in the work of benevolence. I've told you before, I'm going to go ahead and bring this verse in real quick. Acts 11, just to reinforce this. If there was ever a passage where you were going to get universal benevolence, this would be the one right here, okay? Acts 11, verse 27 to 30. In these days, prophets came from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, named Agabus, stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout all the world, which happened in the days of Claudius Caesar. Then the disciples, each according to his ability, determined to send relief to all the world. Doesn't say that, does it? It doesn't say. If there was going to be a passage for universal benevolence, this would be it right here. And it says to the brethren. In fact, it even limits the brethren dwelling in Judea. So all of those passages, not just this one, but if you were going to have a universal benevolence passage, it would be right here in this circumstance. We've got to help as many people as we possibly can, and they limited it to the brethren. So that's the pattern that we see. And just like we don't add an instrument of music because it says sing all the way through, we don't directly help those who are outside the body with the church treasury because of these passages here. It's the same principle. It's the same exact argument. Questions, comments?
In the judgment scene in Matthew 25,
Yeah.
Jesus condemned people for not doing things they're
Right.
supposed to do, like giving them food and giving them water and clothing and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So
And that's pretty strong stuff. Yeah. In fact, I often make the point when I'm preaching on those verses that, depart from me, ye cursed, into the everlasting fire, because you're rapists and thieves and cutthroats and murderers. That's not what he said. Now, they'll go to hell too. But he said, I was hungry and you didn't feed me. I was thirsty and you didn't give me a drink. These are the so-called little things that sometimes we have a tendency to ignore. And those little things are going to make the difference on the judgment for some people. That parable's very powerful. All right, anything else? All right. Now we're going to kind of return to something we were looking at earlier and kind of expand on it a little bit. Tell us the following items are scriptural. Number one, instrumental music in worship. Scriptural or not? Not. Give me a passage.
Colossians 3:16, Ephesians 5:19.
Okay. Anybody have, those are good passages. Anybody have any others? I'm just trying to get feedback from all of you. Any feedback from any other passages anybody might have besides Ephesians 5, Colossians 3? Good passages, right passages. There can be more than one right answer to the question. I think, here's what I had. I had Ephesians 5:19. I also added 2 John 9. I added 2 John 9 to a lot of mine. Anybody know what that says off the top of your head?
What God says.
Yeah. Whoever transgresses and abides not in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. So Ephesians 5:19 tells us what to do. Sing and make melody in your heart. 2 John 9 says don't go beyond that. You do exactly what it says, don't go beyond it. That's the doctrine of Christ. Stay within it. Stay bound by it. Okay, next item on the list. A church hierarchy. I may have to explain that. I don't know if you all know what that hierarchy is. When you've got a government that kind of goes up in a pyramidal type structure where you've got, instead of having this local church under its elders, you'd have this church and 3 or 4 other churches and a board of men above that. And then you go out further into the area and you'd have 4 or 5 other churches and a board of men over that, and those 2 boards get together and there's another board above that, and it just kind of builds up into this hierarchy, okay? A complex organization. Is that scriptural? No. And why is that?
Well, we're given the examples of setting up eldership in each congregation, and they're to have the oversight of that congregation and no other.
Yeah. And by the way, while I'm on that, I'll go ahead and put my verse up there. I had Acts 14:23, elders in every church. Every church has its own organizational structure. And then the elders are to tend the flock of God, which is among them. Okay. So that limits their oversight to a single local church. And then, of course, 2 John 9, don't go beyond that. Don't go beyond the doctrine of Christ. But we're getting ready to start a study when we finish this up on denominationalism. And one of the things we'll stress is what a denomination is, because some of us are not clear on that, okay? And someone will ask us, say, well, you all are a denomination. We say, no, the Church of Christ is not a denomination. And they'll say, well, why not? And we just say, well, it just isn't. Well, that's not good enough. That's not going to cut it. What is a denomination?
God's word.
Okay, it's a grouping of churches, yes. When you look that word up in the dictionary, it is an organization of religious congregations. Think about that a second. That's the definition. Now, it also involves division, so Steve's right. I'm not taking an issue with what Steve said. But by definition, it's an organizational structure where congregations are linked together. And the problem with that is there is no such animal in the Bible. You don't link congregations together. And so think about how that applies to our institutional brethren. When they start linking churches together through a sponsoring church, they have just stepped over into denominational territory, like it or not. That's what they've done. That's exactly what they've done. And they have, by definition, crossed that threshold into denominationalism. Think about that. That's a powerful truth. Okay. Was you going to say something, or did you have a question? I was thinking, maybe not. Was it you? No?
Somewhere that shows the hierarchy of the church. Can't remember what it is. It's just one single verse.
Okay.
You brought it out before.
I think if you're thinking of the one that one you probably use is this. It's in Matthew 20. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's, and if I don't have this, if this ain't what you're thinking of, Steve, you can tell me, but in Matthew 23, let's see if I can find it here. Yeah, verse 8. But you do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and you are all brethren. In the Church of Christ, there's only one step, okay? At the top is Christ. Underneath that is everybody else. Okay, that's elders, deacons, preachers, everybody, all on the same level. You are all brethren. It's not Christ, elders, deacons. No. It's Christ and everybody else. Now, everybody has different jobs. Preachers preach. Elders lead. Deacons serve, but we're all the same. We're all brethren, see. So there's one step. Was that the verse you was thinking of, or the ideal? Had a different one? But that's usually the way I bring it out. But there's different job descriptions, different job functions. But only one big honcho, and that's Christ. And everybody else is on the same level ground underneath him. Okay. Yes?
Obviously the Mormons do, but do you think some denominations use the example of the apostles as being more the board of directors of having a government?
Yeah, I think so. And also, not just the Mormons, but Catholicism would kind of lean in that direction as well. Yeah, they would appeal to that. Of course, our answer to that would be the apostles were not a permanent structure. They did their job and passed away, and we have their work preserved here. But in Catholicism, you have this idea of succession. And in Mormonism, too, you have the idea of succession. Mormonism and Catholicism are organized very similarly. And you have this idea of a head and then a hierarchical structure, and sometimes that's linked. They'll even talk about an apostleship and tie that into the whole thing. Trying to think if I had anything else I wanted to say there. Anybody else have anything they want to add to that?
I used the faith as an example when Jesus washed their feet in John 13. It's an example. There he was, and he made the statement to them, I'm your master and teacher, and rightly so. And look what I've done for you, and you do to your brethren. So he's showing, humility and how that none of us, as you're saying, we have no position of pride or no position of above one another.
Yeah, we are all brethren. That's right. No, there's no big me and little you. Yeah, there's no Jew nor Greek, nor male, female. Yeah, we're all one in Christ in terms of salvation, being saved from sin. What was the next one up here? Church bake sale. I'm looking at that clock. I'm going to see if I can get one more in here. Scriptural or not? Oh, come on now.
First
Be a
Corinthians,
good way to raise money.
First Corinthians 16:2.
Yeah. If you're going to, of course, the answer to the question is obviously no, and 1 Corinthians 16. The church has a way to raise money. God has already spelled that out for us. We lay by and store on the first day of the week, take up a collection, free will offering of the members. Okay, that's the way the church is supported. Not with garage sales, not with bake sales, not with car washes. That's bingo, bingo night, and none of that. So we have, so that's not biblical. Now, I'm doing this for a reason. As you'll see as we go through this, in a minute we're going to change gears. And all the things I'm going to put up there is going to be biblical. And then we're going to come back to that question that we touched on at the beginning of class, and we're not going to have time to do it tonight. Why are some of these things biblical and some of them not? I want you to think about that as we discuss that when we get to that answer. Why are some of these things not mentioned biblical and other things that are not mentioned unbiblical? That's a fair question. It's a good question, it's an important question, and you will get that question from your religious friends and neighbors when you talk to them. Okay. I guess I better hush right there. It's about time to quit within 30 seconds or so. I quit a little early tonight for a change, huh?